Good to see you. So today I'm going to talk about idolatry, just a little discussion. But I'll start with Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words saying, this is verse 1. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven or above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. These commandments are also listed in Deuteronomy 5, but these 3 verses here is the same. There are some differences in the other commandments, or some of them, but these couple are the same. Now, the Bible in a few places does say there are 10 commandments, talking about this set here. But it doesn't anywhere say which one is number 1, number 2, number 3. It just leaves it up to you. So there is a little bit of disagreement on that subject. And so the way we're familiar with, the typical Protestant way, and the way I'll use the numbers for the rest of this message, is that the first commandment is verse number 3, have no other gods before me. And that the second commandment is don't make idols, verses 4 through 6. As a lot of you probably know, the Catholic 10 Commandments starts with have no other gods and don't make idols is their number 1 commandment. So they haven't dropped anything as far as what you got to do, but they just grouped it into the first commandment. And the second commandments don't take God's name in vain. And the way y'all probably know, they make up for an absent commandment to get to 10 by splitting the coveting commandment into 2. The Jewish 10 commandments is, the first one is verse 1. And this one I find odd because that doesn't actually command you to do anything. But their first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's commandment number 1. Their commandment number 2 is the same as the Catholics' commandment number 1. They combine no other gods and don't make idols. So just a quick comment about the word idolatry. The second commandment is technically about idolatry because it specifically mentions idols, the carved images that you would bow down to. However, but it also really encompasses observing a different God. When we say idolatry, there doesn't actually have to be a physical idol there to be guilty of idolatry. So really, both the first and the second commandment is about idolatry. The second one is more specific, and it has the one little bit of facet is that it could be also talking about the true God. He doesn't want you making an idol to him either. But for the most part, that's still idolatry. But so they're really 2 sides of the same coin. And frankly, I can see why you would want to combine them when you're counting. But you got to come up with 10 somehow because it's got 10. So anyway, I'm not sure which one really is accurate. I don't think it matters. All the words are the same. But the important thing is that it is extremely important to God, if by no other, we already know it's one of the big 10, right? Or maybe 2 of the big 10, depending how you count it. But now, so the Bible has many things that it mentions over and over and over. Well, actually, one of these, it's just a side note, was mentioned in this verse here about bringing Israel out of the land of Egypt. And that gets mentioned 100 times probably in the Bible. But another thing that's mentioned a lot is idolatry. And I think it's mentioned by far the most of any of the commandments of the 10. It gets all kind of in. And I was just going to go through some of the examples to support that opinion. Just start off with, we have the golden calf, that whole story. Everybody remembers that, by idolatry. In Kings and Chronicles, time and time again, God measures his leaders, his kings, very often by whether or not they battled idolatry or not. And just to give you an example, just picking one, there's so many examples in there, it was shooting fish in a barrel. I could just almost open the Bible, point to a verse, and pretty quick I could find some idolatry examples. That's how easy it is to find them. But anyway, so this one is 2 Chronicles 28. So Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. For he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and had molded images for the Baals. He burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and he burned his children in the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom God had cast out. And he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, hills, and every green tree. So the main reason God's upset with Ahaz is he's supporting idolatry. So the prophets that were warning Israel to shape up and do right, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, over and over and over, they're warning Israel about their idolatrous ways. And their other general sinfulness, but idolatry is high on their list. And just for example, Jeremiah 9. And this is verse 13, Jeremiah 9, verse 13. Because they have forsaken my law, which I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, nor walked according to it, but they have walked according to the dictates of their own hearts and after the Baals, which their father taught them. And of course, as we know, Baals is referring to false gods. That might have been I don't know that much about Baals. There's probably a lot to know about it, but anyway, it does refer to false gods. So then it goes on, God tells them he's going to scatter them among the Gentiles because of their idolatry and general sinfulness. But then we have Jeremiah 10, which everybody in this congregation is particularly familiar with, because it's where it describes what sounds a lot like a Christmas tree, but it is talking about setting up an idol, and it goes in great detail about what that idol looks like, and don't be worried about it, and it can't talk, and it can't harm you, and all that stuff. So another subject God does with idolatry is he compares it to adultery in a number of places. So for example, in Ezekiel, God compares Jerusalem to a harlot. And these are just a few. So I found this very long passage about that. But so this is just a few verses out of that. And it's Ezekiel 16:35. And when it says, "O harlot," it's speaking about Jerusalem, the city. "Now then, O harlot, hear the word of the Lord, thus says Lord God. Because your filthiness has poured out, and your nakedness uncovered in your harlotry with your lovers, and with all your abominable idols, and because the blood of your children which you gave to them." So I had an odd inflection there. I was into that sentence. There's just an example of God comparing Jerusalem to with their idolatry to adultery. And then we also, on the adultery thing, Hosea, one of the other prophets, is told to marry a harlot to infant. So that's a pretty big deal, just to make a point about how God feels about idolatry. And so this is Hosea. I didn't put what chapter, I think it's chapter 2, verse 1. And when the Lord began to speak to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. So they were just, now they probably were also worshiping other gods, but here it just says they were turning their back on the true God. And he was, so for more examples of idolatry, famous, we have Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. They all got into their respective adventures because they stood up to idolatry and refused to bow down to the idols that were being set up. So that's just an example. And I don't know if you really, I was just struck when I was putting this message together. That's what made me think about it. It's like, wow, this is mentioned a lot. And to me, when something's mentioned that much, it's really important. Now, it doesn't mean something mentioned only once or twice isn't important. I mean, it's important too. But, you know, getting that much repetition, it's just gotta be really important. So now today in our country, other than Christmas, we really don't see that many physical idols in the sense of a religious icon. Now there you might argue other things are idols, but as far as an actual part of religion icon, Christianity doesn't have that many. You might want to argue that Catholics do, and they do. But anyway, but really the verse that applies to us more is the first verse. Have no other gods before me. So I wanted to look at that verse a little bit more in depth. So first of all, when it says before, it doesn't mean that it's okay to have some more gods after the main God, right? The word before in that sentence is more of a phrase like, you guys are before me. Or like I could see in the Wizard of Oz saying, who is this before me? You know, it's just in my presence. And so a lot of translations translate it, you shall have no other gods besides me. But I think maybe translating it, no other gods in my presence would really be the more accurate way to do that. And since we know God's presence is everywhere, that means you can't have any other gods, period. And we all know that. But so while I was reading on this, I actually came across some ridiculous opinions that because it says other gods, that there must be other gods, you know. And it's like, okay. Of course, we know that the word gods with a small g in that sentence is metaphorical, things that people are treating as gods. And so when they say gods, what is it talking about? So we know it is talking about false gods such as Baal. And then talking about that for a second, so if anybody, if the best verse to combat saying other gods means they're actual other gods is 1 Corinthians 8, verse 4. And then this is where Paul's talking. He goes, therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that idol is nothing in the world, and there is no other God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, so he's saying these are so-called. In other words, they're not really gods. And we all know that, but I thought I'd throw out that verse that it's not just our opinion, it's Paul explicitly stating that. So the big question is, what does the little gods mean? Well, of course, like I said, it includes Baals and stuff, but can it include other things such as ourselves, your job, your children, your wife, parents, a football team, you know, other things that you might put on a pedestal? So judging by comments, most Christian writers that I read, a matter of fact, all of them, think that there is, idolatry does encompass that. Almost everybody thinks that. And, I feel like that too. But I was thinking, well, can I give some biblical evidence to back that up? And so this is what I came up with. So, now there is another similar commandment, and it's coveting. They're both, wanting something that's you're not supposed to. And so, but in Ephesians 5, it says, in Ephesians 5, verse 5, for this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater. So I read this as saying the covetous man who is an idolater. You could say, well, he's both. So the other covetous people that's not idolaters are okay. Well, I don't really read it that way. I believe he's saying because he's a covetous man, therefore he's an idolater. Has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Colossians 3 says almost the same thing. Verse 5. Therefore, put your members to death, your members which are on earth: fornication, uncleanliness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So these two verses make an equivalence, or seem to anyway, between idolatry and covetousness. Now, that's interesting, and it does make sense in a way. Maybe if you're elevating something in your mind so that you covet it, in a way, you're kind of making that into a god with a small g, is how I would think. Maybe that's how that comes about. So, and I really didn't come up with a good answer to this, but I asked the question. So what's the difference between coveting, making something an object of covetous, and idolatry? They're not exactly the same, or they wouldn't have two commandments, I wouldn't think. But anyway, so here's one clue for that. In Jeremiah 9, verse 3, we read already, but it says the people didn't follow the law he set up before them, and they walked according to the dictates of their own heart. So maybe it's that when God's a lawgiver, and when you follow your own set of laws, you're making yourself the lawgiver. And maybe in that sense, you're committing idolatry. I don't know, just throwing that out there. Anyway, that if somebody could give me a really good answer on that, it'd be good. But not real sure. I mean, not that it matters so much. Obviously, you've got to battle coveting. You've got to battle idolatry. They're similar. So one last point, and again, I won't be able to really answer because the why questions are hard. Why does God do this or that? But why does he hate idolatry so much? I think we can easily see he hates it, and he hates it a lot. But why? I mean, why does he really care if you believe in something made up, some made up God? Well, I think we can look to that main analogy I mentioned of adultery. It's mentioned to that a whole bunch of times. And, why do we naturally care if our wife, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend is unfaithful to us? We really don't like that. And God kept mentioning that. I think maybe it's a very similar emotion for him that you're being unfaithful to him. And it really offends him. It's not, we're down here and thinking he's feeling like he's got an actual relationship with you, and you are abandoning it, and you're not even recognizing it, really. But actually God says that's the reason. In the commandment I read a while ago, he goes, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, I've always had a little bit of a hard time with that verse, because jealousy is a negative, very negative thing, and it's even mentioned as a sin in some places. So how could God be jealous? But then I got to thinking, well, maybe it's a little bit like anger. Sometimes it's appropriate to be jealous. Let's say your spouse does cheat on you. Probably okay to be jealous at that point. When the ugliness of jealousy, a lot of times, is when you're jealous for no reason. They're not doing anything. You're accusing them falsely. And so when God has righteous jealousy, if you want to put it that way, over us going the wrong way, so I feel like maybe we take him at his word. Part of it is he's jealous. He doesn't like that. Now, I gotta believe that part of the reason is that it's also for our own good. You know, it's our love. If we don't abandon other gods and follow him and him alone, we won't attain salvation. Several of the verses I read mention that. And and so, like, one more verse, there's several, but Revelation 21:8 said, but the cowardly, unbelieving, murderers, sorcerers, and then idolaters shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So that verse just once more nails down that idolaters are in a category that nobody wants to be in. So we need to be sure to eliminate it from our lives. And I feel like that mostly doesn't mean literal idolatry. It does include it, but more of the metaphorical idolatry of putting anything, an object of desire or something, on a pedestal so that it becomes an idol. And I think this is what Jesus was getting at when he said in Luke 14:21, if anybody comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple.